The Fairbanks Summer Fun Fair in June of 2000 was alive with dazzling lights, spinning rides, and the cheerful chorus of children's laughter. Yet for Caroline Walker, the memory of that night would forever be drenched in sorrow. She had taken her 12-year-old twins, Eli and Emma, to the fair as a special treat, watching them dart between booths with the boundless energy only children possessed. They had pleaded with her to let them go through the House of Mirrors, their eyes alight with anticipation, promising to hold hands so they would not get lost. Caroline remembered smiling, her heart warmed by their innocence, before agreeing to wait by the entrance. Minutes later, she realized they had not come out. She called their names, her voice rising above the hum of carnival music, but the glass corridors inside reflected only her own panicked face. At first, she thought it was a game, that they were hiding behind the gleaming panels, giggling as they always did when they played tricks on her. But the deeper she went, the more hollow the maze became. The air grew thick with her fear as she stumbled from one distorted reflection to another, calling desperately, her palms pressing against cold glass that gave her back only her terrified expression. Her heart thudded as she finally rushed out, scanning the crowds, eyes darting to every corner, every shadow. By then, the fairgrounds had shifted from innocent festivity to a landscape of dread. Security was summoned, the music silenced, rides halted mid-motion as floodlights swept across the grounds. The once vibrant laughter of children was replaced with the heavy murmur of confusion and the sharp wail of sirens cutting through the Alaskan night. Strangers gathered, whispering in disbelief as officers poured into the fair, their radios crackling with urgent commands. Caroline stood in the center of it all, clutching Emma's discarded jacket she had found near the entrance, her breath shallow, tears streaking down her face as officers asked for descriptions and timelines. Hours stretched into dawn, the bright lights of the midway, now harsh reminders of joy, ripped away. Volunteers scoured the woods bordering the grounds. Search dogs barked against the silence, but the twins were never found. By morning, the fair was evacuated, families ushered away with their children clutched tightly to their chests, casting wary glances at the woman who had lost hers. Caroline's cries echoed long after the crowds had dispersed, a haunting refrain that would mark the beginning of a lifetime of unanswered questions, her children swallowed by the very place that had promised them wonder. The investigation into the disappearance of Eli and Emma Walker began with urgency, officers combing every inch of the fairgrounds and surrounding woods, their searchlights piercing the midnight gloom. But as the days turned into weeks, the brightness of that initial frenzy dimmed. Suspicion quickly fell on a traveling carnival worker, a man whose background carried shadows of minor offenses, and for a brief time he was treated as the likely culprit. His photograph flashed on evening news broadcasts across Alaska, his name whispered in grocery stores and church gatherings. Yet no evidence tied him to the children, and without proof the theories unraveled, leaving nothing but a void. Caroline Walker sat through interview after interview, her voice hoarse from repeating the same details, her hands trembling as she clutched photographs of her twins, their innocent smiles frozen in time. The summer of that year faded into autumn, the first frost clinging to the spruce trees outside her window, but no answers came. By winter, the snow buried the fairgrounds in silence, the once vibrant House of Mirrors boarded shut, a mausoleum of broken reflections that locals began to avoid. Months turned to years, and the fair returned each summer with its bright rides and sugary smells, as if nothing had happened. But for Caroline, the air always tasted of grief, every laugh of a child, a cruel reminder of what she had lost. The file at the station grew cold, shoved deeper into cabinets, until it was pulled out only for anniversaries or by new officers who thought they could find something missed, only to abandon it again when the trail led nowhere. The Walker home in their remote Alaskan community grew quieter with each passing year, its walls lined with missing posters that had yellowed with age, Caroline unable to take them down, as though removing them would be admitting her children were never coming home. Neighbors offered casseroles, prayers, and soft reassurances, but gradually visits slowed, people uncomfortable with grief that never eased, friendships fraying under the weight of loss, too heavy to carry together. Her husband withdrew into silence, spending long hours in the shed, his eyes avoiding hers, until one day he was simply gone, unable to live inside the emptiness anymore. Alone, Caroline clung to ritual, updating the posters with new printings, standing at the post office bulletin board each year to replace them, the sharp scent of ink on fresh paper, her only proof that she still had fight left. The world moved forward. New fairs came and went. Children grew up. Lives changed. But for Caroline, every day remained frozen in June of 2000, when her twins had vanished into the labyrinth of mirrors, and her heart had been sentenced to a lifetime of waiting. Every June, when the fair returned to Alaska, Caroline Walker prepared herself for the pilgrimage that had become the rhythm of her grief, a ritual that bound her to the memory of Eli and Emma, even as the rest of the world tried to forget. She would rise early on the morning the gates reopened, her hands trembling as she arranged a bouquet of wildflowers from the edges of her property. The blossoms bright against the grey of her modest kitchen table, each petal chosen with care, as though her children might somehow see them. By the time she reached the fairgrounds, families were already gathering, children pulling at their parents' arms with the same impatience her twins once had, their voices high with joy, unaware of the ache that hung over the woman walking quietly among them. The smell of cotton candy and fried dough, once sweet, now pressed on her chest like a weight, each scent a reminder of the night that had stolen everything. She never rode the rides, never bought a ticket, never stayed for the fireworks. Instead, she walked with steady steps past the bright lights until she reached the husk of the old house of mirrors, its boards weathered and warped by decades of seasons, the once glittering attraction now locked and condemned. Locals often turned their heads away when they saw her, some whispering that she was stuck in the past, others pitying her, but none dared stop her as she laid the flowers down at the entrance, her hands lingering on the wood as if pressing through to the echoes of her children's laughter that still seemed to resonate within. Some called it superstition, others obsession, and the younger generation whispered about the strange woman who brought offerings to a building that was said to be haunted, yet Caroline knew it was none of those things. It was survival. Each bouquet was a tether, a way to insist that Eli and Emma had not vanished into nothing, that they were more than the headlines and the cold file buried in a cabinet. She would stand there for long minutes, whispering their names into the stillness, her breath catching as the wind moved through the broken slats, making it sound like faint voices answered back. When she finally walked away, her steps were slow but sure, carrying with them the quiet strength of a mother who refused to let memory wither. For Caroline, the fair was not a place of joy anymore but a shrine, and though people avoided the old house of mirrors, she returned faithfully, year after year, because it was the only place where she could still feel her children alive in the fragile spaces between reflection and shadow. In the summer of 2023, Caroline Walker found herself once again among the bright lights of the fair. Her steps steady with the weight of ritual, the bouquet of fresh wildflowers clutched tightly in her hand as though it were both shield and offering. The air was thick with the mingled scents of popcorn, diesel from the rides, and the faint tang of melting ice, all of it stirring echoes of a past she could never escape. As she walked toward the old house of mirrors, boarded and broken, its paint peeling like scabs against the Alaskan wind, she caught the sound of laughter not from children lost in innocence but from teenagers lingering at the edge of the shuttered attraction. Their voices carried easily over the clamor of the midway, careless and sharp, and she slowed without meaning to, her ears straining toward their words. One of the boys, lanky and brash, was telling the others about the ghost twins, his tone a mixture of mockery and awe, saying he had pressed his face to a gap in the boards and seen small handprints smeared in the dust on the other side. Another jeered, calling him a liar, while a girl shivered and said her older brother once heard voices echoing inside, soft as whispers, calling for their mother. Caroline felt the blood drain from her face, her hands trembling as the flowers threatened to slip from her grasp. She knew the stories children told, the myths that bloomed from silence and tragedy, but hearing Eli and Emma spoken of as specters rather than flesh and blood left her hollow. She wanted to shout at them, to demand they stop turning her grief into carnival folklore, but her voice caught in her throat, choked by decades of sorrow. Instead, she stood in the shadows, her heart pounding as if it would crack her ribs, remembering the small palms of her twins pressing against mirrors all those years ago, their laughter rising like birds startled into flight. The boy swore again that the prints were there, pale shapes in the dust that no wind or time could erase. And though the others dismissed it with nervous laughter, Caroline felt something shift inside her, a thread of dread and hope twisting tight. The fair moved around her, bright and loud, yet in that moment she was trapped in stillness, her eyes fixed on the house of mirrors, the place that had stolen her life. Ghosts or not, she knew she would have to see for herself. When word spread in the spring of 2023 that the condemned house of mirrors was finally set to be demolished, Caroline Walker felt a familiar ache twist deeper in her chest, as though the last tangible link to her missing children was about to be erased forever, and with it the fragile thread of hope she still clung to. She went to the fairground manager, a grizzled man named Howard with thinning hair and tired eyes, and pleaded with him to let her inside one final time before the wrecking crews arrived. At first he shook his head, citing liability and safety concerns, but when he saw the tears pooling in her eyes and the trembling hand clutching a worn photograph of Eli and Emma, his resistance softened and he handed her a key, muttering that she had 1 hour and no more. Caroline returned that evening, the sun sinking low behind the mountains, painting the sky in bruised colors of purple and gold, as if the earth itself carried her sorrow. She carried a small flashlight, its weak beam barely cutting the shadows as she stepped through the creaking door and into the labyrinth of fractured reflections. The air inside was stale, thick with dust and the faint scent of rust, and every mirrored wall seemed to throw her grief back at her in jagged shards. Slowly, she retraced the path her children had taken on that fateful night in June of 2000, her mind conjuring the sound of their laughter echoing through the twisting corridors, the soft patter of their sneakers on the floor. She pressed her hand against the cold glass, following each turn as if she might stumble upon them still waiting around the corner. Her flashlight beam caught glimpses of graffiti scrawled by teenagers, broken panes leaning against the wall, and piles of debris long forgotten by the carnival. Then, as she turned a corner where the maze narrowed into a sharp angle, her light froze upon a panel etched with faint markings. She stepped closer, her breath catching as the letters came into focus. 2 initials scratched deep into the glass, overlapping each other as though carved by hurried, desperate hands. E+E, Eli and Emma. Her knees weakened and she clutched the frame for balance, tears flooding her vision until the letters blurred. For decades, she had been told there was nothing left to find, that the case was cold, that she needed to let go, and yet here was proof her children had been inside, leaving behind a trace of themselves in this place that had swallowed them. The initials shone back at her like a message across time, fragile and haunting, but undeniable. Caroline's flashlight quivered in her trembling hand as she lingered before the mirror carved with the initials, her breath clouding the dusty air, when she noticed a jagged crack running down the panel just beside it, a fault line in the glass that seemed almost unnatural, as if the structure itself wanted to reveal something long hidden. She pressed her palm against the warped edge, and with a groan of old wood and loosened screws, the panel shifted slightly. Enough to let a stale gust of air escape that smelled of rot and forgotten years. Her heart pounded as she leaned in, the beam of her flashlight cutting into a darkness that stretched beyond the maze's intended design. Kneeling down, she saw a narrow crawl space, its walls crowded with cobwebs, the ground littered with sawdust and discarded fair props, faded masks with chipped paint, wooden signs warped from moisture, and fragments of broken bulbs, once meant to dazzle children but now corroded into silence. Her stomach turned as the light fell on something small, half buried beneath debris. A child's shoe, its fabric torn, its colors long since bled into dull shades of gray. Caroline froze, her vision swimming, her mind spiraling with the thought that her children had been forced through this hidden passage, their final moments etched into every shadow. She clutched the shoe gently, her hands shaking as though holding a piece of Eli or Emma themselves, tears spilling down her face in hot, relentless streams. With a surge of resolve, she stumbled back out of the maze and into the cool night air, her cries piercing the fairground until Howard rushed forward, his expression turning grave as she held out the shoe in trembling hands. The police arrived within the hour, their cruisers casting harsh red and blue flares across the deserted grounds, the sirens fading into a heavy silence as officers sealed off the building. Forensic teams entered with equipment, their boots echoing against the hollow walls as they began to excavate the crawl space, pulling out bag after bag of decayed props, dust, and fragments of evidence long overlooked. Caroline stood behind the barricade, her hands clasped tightly as if in prayer, her eyes fixed on the entrance, as though willing her children to emerge at last. The cold Alaskan night pressed in, but for the first time in decades, the case that had been entombed in silence stirred awake, and with it, the fragile hope that the truth was finally within reach. The crawl space inside the House of Mirrors became a chamber of unearthed horrors as investigators moved deeper into its suffocating dark, their gloved hands brushing away decades of dust, while the harsh beams of their lanterns caught fragments that spoke of secrets long buried. Caroline Walker watched from beyond the barricade, her body taut with dread as muffled voices echoed from within, clipped commands and gasps of recognition betraying the gravity of what was being uncovered. Hours stretched like days, the night pressing cold against the fairgrounds, until officers emerged carrying evidence bags heavy with bone fragments, the pale shards rattling like brittle whispers of the past. The announcement came in low voices meant to soften the blow, but nothing could soften it. The remains were not of children, not Eli or Emma, but of an adult male, his skeletal frame marked by violence and decay. Caroline's breath hitched as she remembered the carnival worker once suspected during those frantic first weeks of June of 2000, a man who had vanished from the circuit just as the suspicion mounted. At the time, many had assumed he fled to escape blame, but now it seemed his fate had been sealed within the very walls of the mirror maze, entombed where no one thought to look. The discovery should have offered clarity, but instead it deepened the riddle, the presence of his bones tangled into the fabric of the twins' disappearance like a cruel knot. More chilling still was the object that surfaced beside him, a rusted keychain holding a small flashlight, its casing cracked yet unmistakable, for Caroline knew it as the one Emma had carried everywhere, clipped to her backpack, a talisman of independence she had treasured. Seeing it again, corroded but real, sent Caroline crumbling to her knees, her sobs tearing through the night as she pressed her hands to her face. The officers exchanged grim glances. The evidence sealing the fact that Eli and Emma had been there had passed through that suffocating crawl space, their presence now tethered to the bones of a man who might have been their captor or their failed protector. Forensic teams worked tirelessly, bagging the remains, cataloguing every scrap of metal and cloth, their voices steady yet subdued, aware they were standing in the epicenter of a tragedy that had haunted Alaska for over 2 decades. Caroline remained fixed in her vigil, the image of Emma's flashlight glowing in her memory, its once bright beam now reduced to rust, but its presence screaming louder than words that her children had left a trace, a message carried across time through decay and silence. A message that demanded the case could no longer be ignored. Detectives pored over the brittle case files from the summer of 2000, their fingers smudged with the dust of decades, as they revisited the name that had once stood at the center of suspicion, a man whose photograph had been plastered across newspapers and nightly broadcasts, before vanishing as quickly as he had appeared. His name was Clifford Hayes, a carnival worker known for drifting from state to state with the traveling fair, his reputation clouded by rumors of petty thefts and a temper that flared too easily. In those desperate first weeks after Eli and Emma Walker disappeared, authorities had believed Clifford fled to avoid capture, the perfect villain to shoulder blame when evidence was thin and the public demanded answers. Yet the discovery of bones inside the House of Mirrors cracked open a different truth. For dental records confirmed the remains were his, not a fugitive but a corpse hidden within the very place he was once accused of haunting. Caroline Walker listened numbly as detectives spoke in measured tones, their words carrying the weight of suspicion without conclusion, asking aloud the questions that tormented her sleepless nights. Had Clifford been the abductor who lured her children into the maze, only to meet a violent end at the hands of accomplices? Or had he been a witness who stumbled upon something he should not have seen, silenced before he could tell the truth? The uncertainty gnawed like a parasite, feeding on hope and dread alike, and Caroline found herself staring at his photograph again, the faded image of a man with hollow eyes, trying to read in his expression the secrets that had been buried with him. Detectives traced his employment records, confirming he had been assigned to the fun fair that June, but the paper trail ended abruptly. His pay stub left unclaimed, his tent abandoned in haste. Witnesses recalled seeing him near the House of Mirrors days before the twins vanished, muttering with 2 other workers whose names were long forgotten, men who had melted into the transient tide of carnival life. The theory shifted daily. Some investigators convinced he was the architect of the crime, others whispering he was another victim swallowed by a darker conspiracy that had hidden beneath the fair's flashing lights. Caroline sat in the corner of the precinct conference room as these debates circled endlessly, her mind spinning with images of her children trapped in that mirrored labyrinth with a stranger whose bones now lay tagged in a sterile evidence bag. The past had returned, not with answers but with more ghosts, and once again the truth seemed as elusive as her children's reflections. When the forensic team pried up a warped floorboard deep within the twisting corridors of the mirror maze, they did not expect to find anything more than rotted wood and damp soil, yet what emerged was a small, water-damaged notebook, its cover warped and brittle, the pages clinging together like fragile leaves pressed by time. Caroline Walker stood just outside the taped perimeter as detectives carried it out with gloved care, her heart aching with every step they took, her eyes fixed on that book, as though it might breathe life back into Eli and Emma. At the precinct, under careful lights, the notebook was coaxed open, each page peeled away with delicate instruments until faint lines of ink revealed themselves, faded yet still legible in places. The words inside were jagged and rushed, written by a hand that trembled with fear and urgency, describing dark tunnels beneath the fairgrounds where children were kept in silence, their cries muffled by the roar of generators and carnival music above. Caroline read the fragments with a trembling hand, recognizing Emma's rounded script in the margins, small notes that spoke of hunger, cold, and whispers between her and Eli to stay strong until help came. The entries hinted at days passing, though time seemed blurred within those suffocating walls, with mentions of footsteps, the sound of keys turning, and shadows that lingered longer than they should. One passage described Eli scratching the walls, leaving marks so their mother would know they had been there, his faith in her return woven into every shaky line. But then the writing faltered. The ink smeared by water stains as if tears or spilled liquid had washed the words away, and the pages ended abruptly with a line half finished, "We are going to try," before the ink bled into nothing. Detectives speculated it was written during an escape attempt, a desperate bid for freedom that was never finished. Caroline pressed her face into her hands as she listened, her grief a storm breaking fresh once more, for the notebook was proof her children had lived beyond that night in June of 2000, proof they had fought to survive, even as the world moved on without them. It was both a gift and a curse, confirmation that they had not vanished instantly but had endured days of terror. The notebook became evidence sealed in plastic, but for Caroline it was a diary of lost voices, an echo of her children speaking across 23 years, whispering that their story was not over, that somewhere within the darkness they had tried to come back to her. The call came on a grey morning in late autumn, when the Alaskan sky hung low and heavy, the clouds swollen with snow that threatened to fall at any moment, and Caroline Walker was sitting at her kitchen table with a mug of untouched tea cooling between her hands, her mind still circling the fragments revealed by the journal. The phone's sudden ring startled her, its sharp sound cutting through the silence of her small house like an alarm, and when she lifted the receiver, the voice on the other end was hesitant, quivering, as if each word had to be pulled through years of fear. "My name is Anna," the woman said, her tone strained, "but I used to be Emma Walker." For a long moment Caroline could not breathe, the room tilting around her, as though her body had forgotten how to hold itself up. The voice carried a faint echo of familiarity, a softness buried beneath the years, and though part of her wanted to dismiss it as a cruel hoax, her heart knew better, the way a mother always does. The woman explained she was in her 30s now, that she had lived under another name for most of her life, hiding from the shadow of the men who once held her captive. She spoke in broken sentences, describing nights in the tunnels, the sounds of locks turning, and the moment when chaos erupted and she fled, leaving Eli behind in the darkness because she had no choice. Caroline pressed the phone so hard to her ear it hurt, her free hand clutching at her chest as if she could steady her racing heart, torn between the joy of hearing Emma's voice and the devastation of learning that Eli might not have survived. The woman insisted she had wanted to come forward many times, but fear had kept her silent, the certainty that those who took her were still out there, watching, waiting, ready to drag her back. She said she saw the news about the bones and the journal and realized the truth could no longer be buried, that maybe it was finally safe to let herself be known. Caroline whispered her daughter's name again and again, her voice cracking, tears streaming unchecked down her face as Emma's voice grew steadier, no longer the frightened child of the past, but a woman scarred by survival. The call ended with a promise to meet, to prove what her heart already knew, and as the line went dead, Caroline sat trembling, cradling the receiver like a lifeline, her world split open by grief and hope colliding all at once. When Caroline finally sat across from the woman who claimed to be her daughter, the weight of more than 2 decades pressed into the fragile space between them, every second crackling with disbelief and recognition, and as Emma began to speak, the world outside seemed to vanish until only her voice remained. trembling yet determined, to shed the secrets that had bound her in silence. Through tears, she described how that night in June of 2000, she and Eli had laughed as they darted through the mirrored corridors, their giggles echoing back at them until a shadow loomed from behind a cracked panel and a rough hand beckoned them closer with the promise of hidden wonders. She said the crawl space swallowed them whole, and almost immediately they were torn apart. Eli dragged one way while she was pulled another, their cries swallowed by the music of the carnival above. Caroline sat rigid, every word carving deeper wounds, but she forced herself to listen as Emma spoke of multiple men, their faces half masked by grease paint or hidden beneath the brims of their caps, a part of a trafficking ring that moved silently with the carnival circuit, slipping from town to town while authorities looked the other way. Emma recounted the suffocating days that followed, locked in makeshift rooms beneath the fairgrounds, the air thick with mildew and the sobs of other children, her own desperate hope tied to the sound of Eli's voice echoing faintly through the thin walls, promising her they would escape together. Yet when the chance finally came during a chaotic transfer, when trucks rumbled and voices shouted and doors swung open, she bolted into the darkness, her small body squeezing through a gap no adult could follow, only to glance back and see Eli's hand wrenched away, his scream muffled as he was pulled back by a faceless captor. Her voice broke then, her eyes brimming with a grief that had never left her, confessing that she had carried the guilt like a chain around her neck for every year since, believing that by surviving, she had abandoned him. Caroline reached across the table, her hands trembling as she took Emma's into her own, whispering through her sobs that it was not her fault, that she was only a child forced to choose between life and capture. Emma shook her head, insisting that survival felt like betrayal. But in Caroline's touch, she found a flicker of absolution, a fragile light against the shadows of her story. Emma's voice wavered as she unraveled the truth she had carried for decades, her words painting a picture of corruption so wide and suffocating that Caroline felt the air leave the room with every revelation. She explained that the trafficking ring was not made up of faceless drifters alone, but included carnival workers who blended easily into the transient world of rides and sideshows, their faces forgettable among the blur of painted booths, their crimes hidden beneath the bright lights and laughter. What chilled Caroline even more was the admission that local power had also been complicit, for Emma said a town official, one with authority to sway investigations and dictate what was pursued and what was dismissed, had worked alongside the men, ensuring that suspicion always fell away at the crucial moment. Emma recounted hushed conversations she overheard when she was still a frightened child, whispers of payoffs and threats, the names of families who would never be told the truth, because their grief was easier to manage than their outrage. The man whose bones had been found in the crawl space, Clifford Hayes, was not the villain so many believed, but rather another piece of their machinery, a worker who had grown uneasy with what he had seen and threatened to expose it, only to be silenced in the cruelest of ways. His body was left as both punishment and warning, buried in the very place where children had vanished, while the world was led to believe he was guilty and had escaped into shadow. Caroline felt nausea roll through her as Emma spoke of how the House of Mirrors had been deliberately sealed off after the summer of 2000, not because it was broken or unsafe, but because too many in power knew what was hidden within its walls. Rumors of haunting had been allowed to spread freely, turning tragedy into folklore, because such stories distracted from the darker truth that the building itself was a tomb of secrets, guarded by silence and fear. Emma's eyes filled with anguish as she confessed she had kept quiet because she believed no one would believe her, not when the very people who should have protected her were part of the ring that had destroyed so many lives. Caroline gripped her daughter's hands tightly, her voice a whisper as she vowed that silence would not hold any more. that the web woven around their pain would finally be torn apart, thread by thread, until every name was spoken aloud. Caroline walked slowly through the cemetery as the wind carried the sharp scent of pine from the bordering woods. The sky above washed in the pale light of an Alaskan afternoon that felt neither fully alive nor fully dead, much like the state of her heart. For more than 20 years she had come here alone, laying flowers against a stone that marked a grave which held nothing, whispering words into the cold air that she hoped might travel to wherever Eli and Emma had been taken. Now, for the first time, she did not walk in solitude. At her side was Emma, no longer the girl she remembered with braids and bright eyes, but a woman weathered by years of hiding, her steps tentative yet steady as she followed her mother toward the marker carved with her brother's name. Caroline's grief tightened around her chest as she glanced at her daughter, the joy of reunion clashing painfully with the knowledge that one child had returned, while the other was still lost to silence. When they reached the stone, Caroline placed her hand against it as she always had, her fingers tracing the letters. But this time, Emma's hand covered hers, the warmth startling her as though the boy whose name was carved there had reached out through his sister. Caroline knelt, her knees sinking into the damp earth, and placed a bouquet of wildflowers at the base, their bright colors defiant against the gray stone. She whispered Eli's name, her voice breaking, telling him that Emma was back, that she had fought to survive, that he was not forgotten even if his body had never been found. Emma knelt beside her, silent tears running down her face as she spoke softly to her brother, words of apology and love spilling into the breeze, the confessions of a child survivor finally unburdened at the place meant to honor him. Caroline felt torn apart, her heart cleaved in two, for the sight of her daughter alive filled her with gratitude. Yet the empty stone before them reminded her that joy was forever braided with anguish. The silence stretched, broken only by the sound of the wind moving through the trees, a mournful hymn that carried both sorrow and solace. Caroline rose slowly, pulling Emma to her feet, and for the first time in decades she felt both healing and pain in equal measure, as if grief and joy were two sides of the same coin she would forever carry in her pocket. The weeks that followed Emma's return were a blur of flashing lights, police briefings, and the steady hum of helicopters circling over Fairbanks as the story spread from small-town whispers to national headlines, dragging into daylight the shadows that had lingered for more than 2 decades. Federal authorities descended on Alaska with the weight of years of unanswered questions pressing against their every step, raiding dusty archives in county courthouses, unearthing files that had been deliberately misfiled or buried, and exposing names of men who had once seemed untouchable. What began as a quiet reopening of a cold case exploded into a sweeping investigation as the threads Emma provided unraveled into a web of corruption that clung to the traveling carnival circuit like rot hidden beneath painted wood. Arrests came swiftly. Carnival workers, now older and wearier but still tethered to the circuit, were pulled from their trailers in the early hours, their wrists bound as stunned neighbors looked on. More shocking were the officials named in the files, men who had smiled for community photographs and shaken hands at parades, now led away in silence, their faces pale under the glare of cameras. For Caroline Walker, each arrest was a small stone lifted from her chest, yet none brought the peace she craved. For Eli's absence still echoed in every headline. The House of Mirrors, long shuttered and rotting, suddenly became the most important structure in Alaska. Its warped corridors and hidden crawl spaces turned into a crime scene where forensic lights glowed like false dawn. Federal prosecutors called it the heart of the case, a place where silence had been weaponized, and now it would speak through every scratch, every board, every object unearthed inside. Caroline stood behind the caution tape one last time, Emma's hand entwined with hers, watching as evidence bags were carried out, each one a grim testament to what her children had endured. Reporters clamored nearby, shouting questions, their microphones thrust forward like weapons of truth. But Caroline remained silent, her eyes fixed on the structure that had stolen so much from her, now reduced to an exhibit in a courtroom battle that would stretch across the nation. Justice was finally being unearthed. Yet Caroline knew that trials and convictions could never fill the hollow place inside her where Eli's laughter once lived. Still, as the doors of the House of Mirrors were sealed for federal transport, she allowed herself a single breath of fragile relief, knowing the truth was no longer hidden in glass and shadows. On a chilled morning in late autumn, the crowd gathered at the edge of the fairgrounds, their breaths rising like pale smoke in the Alaskan air, as demolition crews prepared to bring down the House of Mirrors that had loomed like a specter over the town for more than 2 decades. Caroline Walker stood near the front, her arm linked with Emma's, their bodies pressed close, as though sharing warmth against the cold and against the weight of all that had come before. The structure, once glittering with lights and laughter, now stood in ruin, its boards warped, its glass fractured into dull shards that no longer reflected joy, but only the sorrow of what had been hidden inside. Reporters whispered behind them, cameras aimed, their lenses hungry for the moment history was reduced to rubble, but Caroline hardly heard them. Her eyes were fixed on the condemned building, her thoughts on Eli, on the sound of his laughter that still haunted her dreams, on the way he had promised his sister they would find a way out. The wrecking ball swung with a groan of metal, striking the facade, and the sound echoed like a thunderclap, shaking the earth beneath her feet. Glass exploded outward in a cascade of splinters that caught the sun, scattering light like a broken halo before falling lifeless to the ground. Each strike pulled the structure closer to collapse, until at last the maze was nothing but a heap of twisted beams and shattered reflections. The air heavy with dust and silence. Caroline clutched Emma's hand, tears streaming down her face. For though the House of Mirrors had taken her son and scarred her daughter, it no longer had power over their story. Eli had not been found, his body still lost to time and silence, but his existence was no longer erased, no longer just a fading memory on missing posters yellowed with age. Now the truth had surfaced, ugly and brutal, but undeniable, and the lies that once wrapped the town in silence had been torn apart. Closure, Caroline realized, did not mean an end to grief, for grief would forever live in her chest like a second heartbeat. But it meant the story was no longer buried in shadows, no longer denied. As she turned to leave, Emma at her side, Caroline felt the weight shift just enough for her to take a deeper breath, knowing that the mirrors no longer held her children's voices hostage, and at last, their truth stood in the open light of day.